Deep within the dust-choked archives of the Humboldt Redwood State Park, there exists a photograph that defies the logic of the modern world. It was captured in 1915, a frozen moment in sepia where three men stand motionless, staring into the lens with the stoic expressions of their era. But it is not the men who capture the eye. It is their surroundings. They aren't standing beside a tree. They are standing inside one. The stump that serves as their stage is wider than a modern two-car garage, a jagged wooden crater that swallows them whole. To look at this image is to feel a primal sense of vertigo. The men look fragile, almost microscopic, like pilgrims lost in the nave of a collapsed cathedral. But this wasn't a place of worship, it was a processing plant. The living organism that produced this hollowed-out monument was felled in 1912, sliced into cold, utilitarian pieces, and scattered across the American West as fence posts and railroad ties. There was no funeral for this giant. No one recorded the frequency of the sound it made when it finally struck the earth, a sound that must have registered on seismographs miles away. Today, tourists still visit the site, snapping digital photos and calling the remains remarkable. But that word is a shield. It is what we say when we encounter something so vast and so alien that our vocabulary fails us. Alternative researchers often point to this specific era, the late 19th and early 20th centuries, as a period of a great leveling. They suggest that the timber industry didn't just harvest wood. It systematically erased a biological architecture that had stood since before the Norman conquest. Imagine a living pillar taller than a 20-story skyscraper, a sentinel that had witnessed the fall of Rome, removed from the physical plane in a single afternoon. Mainstream history tells us this was simply the price of progress, the necessary fuel for a burgeoning nation. But as we peel back the layers of these forgotten archives, a more unsettling question begins to emerge. Was this truly an act of economic necessity, or were we clearing the stage for a new version of reality? We are told that we are the masters of the natural world, yet we have no sensory memory of what a true forest actually sounds like. We have never heard the acoustic resonance of a 200-foot canopy or felt the weight of soil that hasn't been disturbed for 3 millennia. We are living in the echoes of a world that was processed out of existence before we could even learn its name. And if the giants were this big, what else have we been taught to overlook? The numbers surrounding these fallen giants have a way of turning into ghosts before they ever truly sink in. To understand the scale of what was processed during the Great Leveling, we must look at the icons of our modern world and realize how small they appear in the shadow of the past. The coast redwood, Sequoia sempervirens, did not merely grow. It dominated the vertical landscape, routinely piercing the clouds at heights of 380 feet. For context, the Statue of Liberty, from its stone base to the tip of its golden torch, stands at 305 feet. These trees weren't just taller than our greatest monuments. They were the dominant biological architecture across 2 million acres of the Pacific coast. They were not rare anomalies or freakish outliers of nature. They were the standard. Proponents of alternative history often suggest that these measurements taken by the very men who were sent to destroy them hint at a world with a completely different atmospheric density or energetic frequency. They point to the General Sherman tree, a behemoth that still stands today only because it was deemed too unprofitable to move. It contains enough wood to build 40 houses and was already 800 years old when the first Viking longships touched North American shores. But to the industrial mind of the 19th century, this wasn't a living witness to history. It was 50,000 cubic feet of untapped revenue. This is where the sensory amnesia of our generation begins. We are told by mainstream historians that we have successfully preserved the best of the old world in our national parks, but alternative researchers argue that what we see today are merely the scraps, the saplings, left behind after the titans were cleared. You have never stood beneath a canopy so dense that it created its own weather system. You have never experienced the specific green cathedral acoustic where the sound of a bird's wing beat could carry for a mile. We have lost the biological memory of the mycorrhizal networks, the subterranean internet of fungi that once connected the entire continent in a silent, chemical conversation. The mystery deepens when we realize that this entire ecosystem was dismantled in a single human lifetime. We are living in a world that has been stripped of its sensory depth, left to wander through a landscape of second-growth forests that look impressive only because we have forgotten what extraordinary actually looks like. If these trees were the biological nervous system of the old world, what happened to the Earth when that system was unplugged? And more importantly, why were the men who cut them down so desperate to ensure that not a single one of the true ancients remained within reach of the burgeoning cities? The year 1850 marked the beginning of a biological siege. While the California gold rush drew thousands of hopeful prospectors looking for wealth beneath the soil, a different kind of extraction was occurring above it. To build the cities of San Francisco and Portland, and to lay the tracks that would stitch a continent together, the timber industry required a sacrifice of unimaginable proportions. What followed was not a harvest. It was a liquidation. Between 1850 and 1910, the old-growth forests that had stood for millennia were reduced by over 96. This wasn't a slow transition, it was a 60-year erasure that transformed North America's Pacific coastline from a primordial sanctuary into a factory floor. The technology of the era evolved with terrifying efficiency. Standard axes and two-man saws were replaced by steam-powered donkey engines and massive crosscut blades that could bite through 30 feet of ancient bark. Entire towns were constructed overnight in the shadow of a single grove, existing only until the last titan fell. Once the wood was processed, the town was simply abandoned, leaving behind concrete foundations in the middle of a graveyard of stumps. Gifford Pinchot, the first head of the U.S. Forest Service, once described a cut-over region in Humboldt County not as a forest, but as a field of truncated monuments. He was a man of science and bureaucracy, yet even he was forced to use the language of ruins. He wasn't looking at timber. He was looking at the debris of a fallen civilization. Mainstream historians argue that this was a tragedy of unpriced externalities, a fancy way of saying the market didn't know how to value a living tree. But alternative researchers see something more deliberate. They point to the Timber and Stone Act of 1878, which allowed corporations to buy 160-acre plots for pennies by claiming the land was unfit for cultivation. By labeling these ancient cathedrals as unfit, the system essentially declared them obstacles to be cleared. Proponents of this Great Reset theory suggest we weren't just harvesting resources. We were clearing away the evidence of a world that didn't fit the new narrative of industrial progress. If these trees were the monuments Pinchot claimed they were, what exactly were they memorializing? And as the saws moved closer to the Sierra Peaks, did they begin to encounter something even more permanent and even more mysterious than wood? As the saws silenced and the dust of the 19th century timber boom settled, a more radical question began to circulate in the fringes of the intellectual underground, a question that challenges the very foundation of our planetary history. If a 300-foot redwood leaves behind a 15-foot stump that looks like a truncated monument, what would a 3-mile-high tree leave behind? Alternative researchers point toward the silent, stone sentinels we call mesas, buttes, and mountains. They suggest that our maps are not filled with geological accidents, but with the petrified remains of a biological era so vast it defies modern comprehension. This is the no forests on flat Earth theory, a controversial lens through which the world's most iconic landmarks are reimagined as the severed ankles of ancient, silicon-based giants. Take, for instance, the enigmatic silhouette of Devil's Tower in Wyoming. Mainstream geology classifies this formation as a Lacolithan igneous intrusion of columnar basalt formed by volcanic activity millions of years ago. Geologists point to the cooling process of molten rock to explain the near-perfect hexagonal pillars that make up its structure. However, proponents of the giant tree theory see something else entirely. They look at those same hexagonal columns and see a striking resemblance to the microscopic cellular structure of modern plant life, scaled up to an impossible magnitude. They point to the way the base of the tower flares outward, mimicking the root system of a tree, and how the vertical striations on the rock face mirror the texture of bark. To these theorists, Devil's Tower isn't a volcano. It is a fossilized stump, a remnant of a canopy that once brushed the edge of the atmosphere. This contrast creates a profound tension in our understanding of the Earth. While mainstream science provides a rigorous framework of plate tectonics and volcanic cooling, the alternative narrative taps into a deep, mythological memory of a world tree present in almost every ancient culture, from the Norse Yggdrasil to the Mayan Ceiba. These researchers argue that the Great Leveling of the 1800s was merely the final cleanup of a much older, global harvested transition from a biological, silicon-based world to our current carbon-based reality. They suggest that the mountains we climb are actually the debris of a gargantuan ecosystem that was mined or processed out of existence long before recorded history began. If this theory holds even a grain of symbolic truth, it suggests that we are living in a world of ruins, walking over the stumps of an era that was literally larger than life. It forces us to look at the Great Plains or the plateaus of the American Southwest not as empty spaces, but as the clear-cut floor of a primordial garden. But if these massive stone structures were once living organisms, what force possessed the power to fell them?